Today we're going to talk about a research study that highlights a shift in how researchers come to understand beta brainwaves frequencies, typically between 13 to 30 hertz, where traditionally beta brainwaves activities were thought to be relatively continuous and steady, especially during tasks requiring attention, sensory processing, and motor planning. However, this particular paper emphasizes a newer understanding of beta brainwaves frequencies in that beta activity actually occurs in short, intense bursts rather than being sustained and continuous electrical activities. And here is what these researchers mean when they talk about bursts within the beta brainwaves frequencies in the brain. They mean that instead of constant rhythm, beta activity shows up as a brief, powerful episode, like bursts, that last hundreds of milliseconds and occur sporadically, where these bursts are thought to help inhibit or control the neural processing, allowing the brain to fine-tune when and how to process sensory inputs or initiate motor actions. And because these bursts are brief, they are introducing a dynamic component of brain activity where these bursts aren't just random, they seem to occur in meaningful spatial and temporal patterns across the brain, potentially mapping into different cognitive operations. And recent advances in analysis methods have also allowed researchers to detect and characterize these bursts of beta activities more precisely, revealing that there's a lot more structure and diversity in beta brainwaves activities than previously thought. So with this introduction, let's get into this, covering this paper. Brainwaves frequencies within the human brain are linked to the control of goal-directed processing of sensory information and the timing of the motor output. Recent evidence demonstrates that the beta waves frequencies are not sustained but organized into intermittent high power bursts, mediating timely functional inhibition. This implies that there is a considerable moment-to-moment variation in the neural dynamics supporting cognition. Beta waves frequency bursts thus offer new opportunities for studying how sensory inputs are selectively processed, reshaped by inhibitory cognitive operations, and ultimately result in motor actions. Recent method advances reveal the diversity in beta waves frequency bursts that provide deeper insights into their function and the underlying neural circuit activities within the human brain. This study proposes that brain-wide spatio-temporal patterns of beta frequencies bursting reflect various cognitive operations and that their dynamic reveal non-linear aspects of cortical as bursts of brainwaves frequencies reflect abrupt transitions between low and high amplitude of brainwaves. They are a hallmark of non-linear brain dynamics. Unlike Gaussian signals, for example, the amplitude of brain waves do not follow smooth fluctuations. Instead, it is subject to abrupt shifts with considerably higher likelihood of large power extreme events than expected by a normal distributions of electrical activities within the brain. Third, intermittent brainwaves oscillation casts new light on large-scale interactions within the brain, the collective coordinated dynamics between regions of the brain may offer computational versatility with transient brainwave interaction, providing a dynamical substrate for flexible cognitive cognition. In this view, new event-based analysis methods or information theoretical measures better capture the dynamical nature of interaction between non-linear nodes of brain cells than conventional spectral coherence and linear correlation. Fourth, intermittent brainwaves oscillations encourage new ways to examine experimental data from the brain. The modulations of average band power of the brainwaves by cognitive states could be driven by various characteristics of underlying bursts, including their amplitude, frequency range, rate, and duration, providing additional insights into the underlying mechanisms. The temporal distribution of bursts of beta waves frequencies cast also new light on neural variability. In addition, the precise timing of these brainwaves bursts in single trials offer opportunities for event-based analysis, such as temporal analysis of neural activities within the behavior of the subject. In other words, beta brainwaves frequencies is manifested as brief bursts that reflect functional inhibition and thus have an analogous role in cognition, as in motor planning and execution. These scientists then propose that brain-wide spatio-temporal beta brainwaves frequency burst patterns reflect cognitive strategies, which then they are referred to as spatial computing, for example, which we've also talked about in this channel. These patterns are a correlate of the functional inhibition that orchestrates the execution of cognitive strategies by first shaping sensory processing and ultimately controlling motor outputs. The transient dynamic of bursts of beta waves implies that these functional operations may be discrete rather than continuous. The growing evidence for a fundamental role of beta brainwaves burst patterns in executive functions opens several new research avenues in cognitive neuroscience. These scientists also say that there is a need to continue studies that shed light on the potential diversity in function of beta waves bursts beyond inhibition, as well as the circuit level origin. While the scientists have focused on beta bursts, transient activity in other bands, such as alpha, gamma brainwaves frequencies, and how they relate to beta brainwaves will also be important direction for future research. Beta brainwaves frequencies and oscillations in a wide range of frequencies have often been treated as the same rhythm, the same frequencies. However, both low and high beta frequency peaks in a beta band have been commonly reported and referred to as beta 1 and beta 2, for example, with partly varying functional correlates. Likewise, tracking the central frequency of cortical beta activity measured reveals shifts in the central frequency of beta burst, over the course of an experimental task, for example, or even within single beta bursts. Distinct beta frequencies may also reflect the origins of the underlying bursts, with faster frequencies arising in the higher areas in the cortical hierarchy. In addition, instantaneous dopamine levels modulate the central frequencies of beta brainwaves within the cortex and within the basal ganglia in humans, and in non-humans primates, consistent with instantaneous frequency reflecting the level of excitation. Thus, differences in the central frequency of beta of bursts may sometimes reflect changes in excitation within the brain frequencies, but other times reflect brain waves generated by distinct neural processes with potentially different functional. Beta brainwaves bursts also appear to provide functional inhibition in a wide range of cognitive processes and cortical areas within the brain. However, there have been conflicting findings regarding whether the inhibitory role of beta bursts is reflected in reducing firing rates of the neurons. These researchers propose that functional inhibition may be implemented in different ways on the neural or circuit levels, for example, by reducing the overall firing rates of the neurons. Many research studies have come to establish that beta brainwaves frequency bursts correlate with inhibitory executive function within the working memory of the humans. Researchers use, for example, various type of recording in prefrontal cortex of non-human primates to test predictions from computational models. These studies confirm that beta brainwaves bursts reflected intermittent inhibition during various stages of working memory control, such as encoding, the readout, and the selection deletion of information within the working memory. Beta brainwaves bursts were spatially and temporally correlated with gamma brainwaves frequencies, which are between 40 to 100 hertz, which in turn associated with elevated spiking informative of the working memory content. Some of the remaining questions is, for example, what are the origins of these beta brainwaves bursts within the brain? At the circuit level, it is still uncertain how transient state of beta brainwaves are generated, which neurons are involved, and what are the system levels mechanisms that govern transitions to high power brainwave states. And on the functional level, little is known about the control mechanisms that decide when to generate these beta. And what is the relationship between beta brainwaves bursts and the spiking of neurons in different neural populations? Some findings suggest that the beta brainwaves bursts implement functional inhibition, but what is the nature of inhibition in the microcircuit level? How do beta brainwaves bursts spread in different type of interaction within the different brain regions? Do arriving bursts trigger locally generated bursts in the receiving area of the brain, or Alternatively, do bursts of beta brainwaves in the receiving regions of the brain reflect the activity imposed by the sending area of the brainwaves? All these questions pose extremely exciting and new areas for us to start understanding the brain's electrical activities more and more and more. And while reading these type of research paper might feel for you that you're stretching your mind, after a while when you start reading them more and more, you start getting a little bit more familiar with the terminologies, and it becomes a little bit easier to grasp the gut instinct of the researchers who are conducting and working on these studies. Another thing I want to mention is that sometimes, considering the fact that there are so many more interesting things happening in the world, reading such papers always feels like it's too much of a detail to go into, and it's not very interesting. And we need to think about bigger things in life. While I agree with you, the truth of the matter is that a lot of these studies, although they seem that they are just focusing on one particular, very specific and tailored and focused topic, the reason they are very important is because they are, although small, stepping stone for us to understand more and more and more about how the brain functions and how the biological systems functions, for that matter. Because at the end of the day, it's like drops of water that kind of compiles then into a big bucket of water that, let's say, 10, 20, 30, even 50 years from now, they all add up, and then we come up with huge findings for wherever these small findings take us. Because at the end of the day, a lot of studies and lit reviews that we do today will also look at the previous generation's studies, and that is what a literature review basically mean. And so we are building upon what was found years and decades ago, and we built upon it, and based on that we make larger findings. And all of these scientific studies, a lot of them also eventually translate into practical and technology findings, technological findings that then in the future become more practical findings and practical solutions, the way in which we have been able to evolve scientifically and technologically even today. So a lot of things that are being built today, they are being built upon what scientists found maybe a decade ago or something like that. And so it's important to think of these type of research studies that way, and then suddenly then they become much more exciting and interesting to follow. I will link the paper below as always, and so that you can read it for yourself if you want to read it, because it's a quite long paper. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.